We're ready? You ready? Scott's ready. So we're going to begin. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank y'all for being here today. My eyes from this wind and allergies are real dry. So if I'm looking at you funny, it's not you, it's me. A couple of announcements. Can you, Melissa, actually on the soundboard, can you find me and just turn it down a smidge? I feel like I'm a little hot. Do you see which one it is? Should say preach or preacher, I think. One of them will be lighting up green because it's picking me up. Do you see it? Just a smidge. A little bit. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Perfect. Thank you. That's great. Two announcements tonight, and then we'll get into our passage. One, you'll most likely get an email or some sort of notification about this tomorrow. But for those who are interested, and we've talked to some already, but our two mission trips we have lined up for this summer, we're having a follow-up kind of planning and training and update informational meeting March 30th. So not this Sunday, but the next. And it will be at 12:45, so right after the second service. And the rumor, and it's a true rumor, is we will provide lunch for you. So if you're interested, or if you're already told us you want to go on one of them, please come to that. Let us know, and then come to that, and we'll have more specific information so we can get moving forward, because those are coming up real quick. And we are really excited about both those opportunities. And so even if you don't end up going yourself, there are always opportunities for you to help support that work through prayer. Absolutely. Very, very, very important. We desperately need that. Financial support and other little things too. And so one of the things that Sonny talks about when we talk about these things, and Jim Perkins also talked about, is not just the team that's going, but the church as we're sending and as we're supporting as they go too. And so it involves all of us in so many different ways. So be thinking and asking questions about that if you want to know more information. And then secondly, tonight is business meeting night. And so after the conclusion of our lesson and our prayer time, then we'll go into business meeting. So that's it. All right, Philippians chapter 2. We are going to finish chapter 2 tonight. We've been in it for a little while. I'm not going to do like a full section-by-section recap, but I do to kind of get our memories going. It's been a week. And this is an open-ended question. Not any answer goes. There are some wrong answers, but with your books open in front of you, so open book quiz, what are some of the key ideas or the big things that we've covered so far that we've worked through here in this letter to the Philippians that you remember? Any big ideas? Go ahead. Okay, so God is the primary actor. And so this shows up in chapter 1 and chapter 2. This is absolutely a key theme, that this is his work. He started it, he sustains it, and he's going to finish it. So that should encourage us in each step of the journey as we're going. God is the one who's called us. God is the one who's empowering and sustaining us. And God's ultimately the one who's going to bring us to wholeness and fullness with him, in him, forever. Absolutely. Good. What else? What else has stood out to you so far, or you remember from our study? Any key themes or ideas? Yeah, so the attitude we should have when we approach and engage each other should be like who? Paul goes on to say, like Jesus. And Jesus is the prime example of what it looks like to love and to serve others sacrificially and in humility and in great love. And Jesus isn't just an example to follow. He is that, but also, linking with Brian's theme, it's God at work. As we are following the Lord, he's empowering us, enabling us to do so. And I want to piggyback on that. Why does that matter for us? That goes into what we covered 2 weeks ago, or last week I think it was. Do all things without grumbling or complaining. We talked about that. And why did we say that's important? Why does that matter? So we have the right focus? Absolutely. Why else? Yeah, we're to be in unity, which represents, bears witness who we belong to and what he's done and what the gospel means, and how the gospel isn't just an idea in our heads or something we talk about. It's a belief. It has to show up and work its way out through how we then live our lives. That's going to show up again a little bit tonight. Absolutely. And also, just practically speaking, do you like being around people who are miserable and grumpy and fight all the time? No. No. Do you? Okay. Well, okay. We'll talk after the lesson tonight, Scott. We have some things to work through. Or maybe that's God's calling on your life to provide extra love for difficult people. But yeah, either way, it's good. It blesses us. It works towards our unity, and it displays and declares what God has done for us and how He's at work in our midst. Absolutely. One last key thing I want to mention. Actually, two. In Paul's words, and we've agreed with him each time it's come up, who does he think? So God is ultimately responsible. He's the main character of this gospel story. But who all should participate in the ministry of the gospel? All of us. Now, it's going to play out in different ways. Not everyone's going to be a Paul or a Timothy or an Epaphroditus, which we'll talk about tonight. But all of us, Paul says, are to partner, to work together and come alongside each other to support the work of the ministry, to support the advance of the gospel, to live out God's kingdom, to bear witness in all these different ways. So this is going to be important, that it's not just similar to what I was saying earlier as we send mission teams on mission trips literally around the world, it's not us saying, hey, y'all go do these things and then come back and tell us how it went. How can we partner? How can we come alongside? How can we support? Even if we're not there ourselves, how can we make sure they're not going by themselves? Does that make sense? That's what Paul is saying. And so he's encouraging the Philippians, who were a good example of this, supporting him in his ministry, caring about what he was going through, praying for him, sending care packages, all these kind of things. Paul says, you are partners with me in the gospel, and we'll talk about that more tonight. And then lastly, there's a word, it's 3 letters, and it shows up in various forms all throughout the letter, and it's joy. Joy is a major theme of this. And we said this is remarkable because where was Paul when he wrote this? Not in a traditionally joyful place, right? He's not in the happiest place in the world. He's in prison. And why is he in prison? Because of the gospel. So because he's following Jesus, his life, he's facing all this hardship. And we know Paul's story, the things that he went through. And yet he can't stop talking about how joyful he is and how much joy it brings him and how they should be rejoicing because he's rejoicing because all these great things God is doing. And so we'll see that show up again tonight too, that we can tell, this is kind of like a side note to a side note, we can tell often that we're on the right track as we're living out our faith. One, when we face hardship or opposition because of it, Jesus told us that. Listen, hardship's coming. Suffering's coming. If they were opposed to me, they're going to be opposed to you, so don't be startled by this. But Paul also says, but yet, in the midst of it, there's great joy. So you can know you're on the right track, even if it's hard, because the joy of the Lord will be upon you and then working through you. So we'll see a little bit of that tonight as well. All right? Let's get into it. If someone can read out loud for us, we're going to read the whole passage, but it'll break up really cleanly into 2 main parts. But if someone could read it for us, chapter 2, verses 19 through 30. Preferably out loud. Okay, thank you. So we have two examples here that Paul shines a light on, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And we'll talk about each of them in turn. But first, I think this is a good question that I had never thought about until today, working through this. Why do you think Paul, he doesn't tell us why, but we have some good clues. Why do you think Paul covers this right in the middle of the letter? Like he had been covering a lot of deep theological work and giving instructions, giving directions, explaining things. Again, theological matters and then how it plays out in our lives. Often when he gets into sections like this of kind of practical matters, kind of travel plans, that sort of thing, I plan to come, or I'm sending, or so-and-so, or, be sure to bring me this. That usually shows up at the very end of a letter, kind of like a PS, and we see that in some other of Paul's letters. But for some reason in Philippians, that kind of seemingly boring travel plan material shows up right in the middle of the letter. What do you think is his thinking? Okay, so there's some encouragement going on? Yeah, absolutely. Why else? Okay, shows his heart and he still has hope about his condition? Absolutely. I think also if we read it in context of what he's been talking about just over the last chapter, in chapter, kind of the end of chapter 1 into chapter 2, he's talked about living out your faith and working out your faith and living in such a way that the gospel is clear, these kind of things, following the example of Jesus. And then he gives us two really good examples of people who do that. And so I think it's a little bit of all these things wrapped up in, I think that's where his train of thinking is going. That this isn't just random, travel plan material. Some of it is that because they're wanting updates from him and updates about these two guys in particular. And he includes it here because it flows out of what we've been talking about and the example of Jesus. How we're supposed to treat each other, how we're supposed to live out our faith, and to be a witness in all these ways. He's like, these are two really good guys who live this way that we could learn from. A good example to look at. And so let's talk about each of these. The first one he mentions, this is verses 19 through 24, is Timothy. And he says, I'm going to send you Timothy, but not yet, soon. Why was he not sending him right away? What does Paul say? That's the second one, so we'll get to him, Epaphroditus. The first one, yeah. Because Paul needs him. He's like, I'm going to let him go. I'm going to send him back to you. We've got good things there, but for now, I need to hold on to him because he's helping me, and I'm going to keep him until I kind of know what's going on here in my situation, kind of the outcome of my trial. Again, Paul's in prison awaiting trial, and he wanted to keep Timothy if he could, according to his plans to this point. We'll come back to that point, but he wants to keep him until he knows kind of how things are going to shake out. And in Paul's mind, what he says here, what makes Timothy so special? What stood out about him? Do what? Yeah, so kindred spirit, he's like a son to me. What else? Do what? He's genuinely concerned. Is that what you were saying too? Yeah, so what Paul starts touching on here, and we're going to see a little bit with Epaphroditus as well. Again, this is why I think it's more than just travel plans, because he starts talking about these guys' character and how their godly character shows up in their lives. And so he's highlighting it by way of encouraging them, but also encouraging the Philippians and explaining, here's a case point, here's a case study of what it looks like to live the way that God has called us to. And so I want to talk about each of these things that we see about Timothy and his character and the example that he sets. The first thing, if you want to kind of put a heading over what Paul explains here, how highly he views Timothy, in my translation, this is verse 20, I have no one like him. Others might have a slightly different translation there, but a literal translation is there's no one of like mind or like spirit. So Timothy is kind of like a head above the rest. There are other great people, other great workers out there, but I have not come across another Timothy. He is valuable and precious to me. And he goes into explaining why he feels that way. And you already touched on one of them. The first one is he had genuine concern. For the Philippians. What does that mean? What do you think that means? We'll talk here in a second about why we think that matters, but what do you think it means that he had genuine concern for them? So these things are real to him. So he lives out his faith, and he's not just talking the talk, but he's willing to walk the walk. Why else? Or what else do you think that means? And that's going to bleed into our next point too. Do what? So he's filled with the love of God. Yeah. Let me ask you this question. Is there a difference between being nice and polite and being good? Being caring, being compassionate? You could probably tell by the way I'm talking. Absolutely there is. There are a whole lot of people. I had a friend, let me tell you a short story. I had a friend in high school. Oh my goodness. And she was so sweet, and she was so trusting and so kind and so naive. And I would talk with her all the time. Hey, it's like I was her dad or something. Hey, there's a difference between someone who is nice to you and someone who is truly good. And you need to learn this difference, because a lot of people can present that they're nice, but actually be really shady. Or a lot of people might be nice and polite, but don't actually care for you, and so they're not really all that trustworthy. You need to make sure you can discern the difference. And it's true in ministry, in life, and all sorts of things. But Paul is saying Timothy, who was well known by this point, by a lot of different churches, because he's been traveling around with Paul, Timothy isn't just a nice guy or a skilled guy. He is a good guy, and not like a good old boy kind of guy, but like truly he cares about what he's preaching, about what he's teaching. He cares about the people that God cares about, which is everyone. And so he thinks highly of Timothy, because Timothy isn't just kind of like generically praying or caring about the Philippians. Paul says his concern is real and it's genuine. He actually cares about what you're going through. To put it differently, in my line of thinking, in my line of work, Timothy is a pastor and not just a leader. Do we see the difference there? Again, there's nothing wrong with being a leader. There are a lot of great leaders in all walks of life, from all different faiths and all different categories or whatever, and that's not what God's people always need. They need a pastor. A pastor cares. A pastor is like of the people, with the people, walking through the things that they're walking through. And Paul says that's the kind of guy that Timothy is. He truly cares. So he's not just like one of Paul's like lackeys or like henchmen or an enforcer or even like a substitute teacher for Paul. If Paul can't be there, I guess we'll send Timothy. No, he was a real, true pastor who loved the people that he was called to serve. So that was one thing that Paul says about Timothy is a good thing. And so what difference does it make if you have a pastor who is pastoral, or if you have someone in your midst, a leader, who has a genuine concern for the people? What difference does that make? A lot. Yeah, you're like, I know it's good, I don't know how to articulate it. Let me get us moving in the right direction. I think there's a difference I'm learning and I'm exploring as I'm a pastor and growing up in ministry and these sort of things. But there is a difference between leadership, generally, and pastoral leadership. And it's not that they're like opposites necessarily, and leadership isn't bad. It's good, it's important, but it's entirely possible to lead a group of people in a way that is disconnected from the people. And you can do that in business. A lot of times that happens in business, like the CEO or whoever's up top is leading, they're making decisions, and they can be really, really good at it. And the business can grow, and the profit margins can go all, they can be highly successful in all these ways, but it doesn't mean that they're known or that the people are really cared for. It just means they're good at business, right? And I'm not trying to villainize that at all. Oftentimes, yeah, it can be kind of selfish. It can get that way. But in church life, too, it's entirely possible to have a leader who's really good at organizing, at structuring, at making decisions, and the church can grow and it can flourish in a lot of ways and look really successful. And that's not bad in and of itself, but that's different from a pastor who loves and cares for the flock. Do we see that? And Paul says Timothy's not just a leader, he was a skilled leader. He could organize, he could lead, he could make decisions, he could challenge, he could counsel, he could do all these things. He had the skill set, but what's most important is he actually cared about the people he was leading. And that makes a really big difference. And most importantly, God cares about that, right? So that's the first thing that Paul says about Timothy. Secondly, this is something going back to what Brian mentioned, the way I summarize it, is he had the right priorities. So he cares about the people themselves first, this is straight out of the beginning of chapter 2, the example that Jesus set, and what Ronnie mentioned earlier about caring for the interest of others before yourself, above yourself. He had the right priorities in that he was willing to serve, but ultimately, who was his mind set on? Yes, it's into verse 21. Verse 21 says, other leaders seek their own interests and not those of Jesus Christ. The implication being that Timothy cares about the people, but most importantly, he's listening to Jesus, and he's following Jesus, his example and his teachings and his direction. He values what Jesus values, and he goes where Jesus sends him. So what difference does that make in the life of a church? Yeah, every difference, right? Again, we are, there's a lot that overlaps with us in our church today, but there's a lot that's different. A lot of the Philippians, if you remember, this season of their life, were really suffering, specifically because they were Christians. A lot of them were facing hardship that you and I do not face today because of their faith. And so having a leader who is aware of that, who cares about that, who's walked that walk and still cares for you, but also a leader whose primary focus isn't power, isn't self-gain, isn't making sure that he's okay, but that Jesus is followed and that Jesus is glorified, that makes a direct impact on the life of a church community, doesn't it? Back then and today. So this is absolutely indispensable for a leader in a church community, having your eyes and your focus squarely on Jesus first and foremost. Whose church is it, by the way? It's God's, right? So it's good to remember that like, hey, we may be part of this church, or a lot of times the language we use now, we might go to this church, but we are the church, but it's not ultimately ours. It's his. And that needs to be reflected not just in our name, and not just in like who we pray to, that's part of it, but like our daily decisions, our daily existence. Are we leaning on the power of Jesus? Are we listening? Are we following the Spirit as he leads us? Because again, it's entirely possible to play church and to be really good at it and successful in some good ways, but that is ultimately empty if our hearts aren't daily, moment by moment, shaped by and listening to and subservient to and enjoying and worshiping and following Jesus. And Paul says, but Timothy's got it. He's got it. He's got his eyes on the right thing. All right, the third thing, I'm picking this up from beginning of verse 22. Someone read the beginning of verse 22 again. There's a certain phrase I'm looking for. Boom. Proven character. What does that mean? Yeah, he walks the walk. Proven, he lives in such a way that it has been on display. He has a reputation that precedes him in the best way possible. He has lived this out. He has experienced. There's a track record here. Again, this isn't a guy who's promoting himself, and this guy isn't new or unknown or anything like this. This is a guy who's been through it, who's been living it, who's been working, who's been walking, who's been serving, who's been doing all these things. He is well known to this point, and for really good reason. He is a seasoned veteran. Yes, ma'am? I don't know. Timothy? I don't know. So like he's, and like Paul's other letters, like to Timothy, we get the idea that he's young, but I don't know what that means anymore. Do y'all think I'm young? Okay, I'm almost 40. Isn't that wild? Is that young? Is it? Y'all are making me blush. That's not young. 40? I remember growing up, 40 was like, man, that's so old. But now I'm almost 40. I'm like, is it? I'm a baby. Jonathan, our worship pastor, y'all know how old he is? He's like 24. That's a baby. All right, Jonathan. But anyway, so I don't know. It's relative. Younger. He's not as old as Paul, but what's interesting, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, in all seriousness. What's interesting, though, because this shows up in Paul's letter to Timothy, and I need to search. I don't remember the timeline of which one was written first, this one or that one. I think First and Second Timothy. Anyway, I'll get back to you on that. But this is important then to say, hey, I'm not just sending you this young guy who's excited and who means well and is skilled. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but he's saying that he's seasoned. So even though he's young, he has experience. He has a wealth of knowledge. He's a proven track record of not him trying to prove himself and how much he knows, but you have seen his heart and his character on display of how he pastors and how he follows Jesus and how he's gone through really, really hard things because of it, but he's still here. And he's, yeah. Good. Yeah. So that's the fourth thing. Absolutely. She says, following up with the rest of 22, how did I put it? How did I summarize it? Like a son to Paul. What does that mean? What does it mean for Paul to say Timothy is like a son to me? I think it means at least two things. I want to see if we can figure it out. What do you think? So first and foremost, I love this boy. He's young. He's like a son to me. That's a good thing. That's not like, this dumb little kid or whatever. No, like I love this young man. And so there's an affection there. Paul, and like in a lot of ways, has that pastoral. We talked about this with 1 Corinthians, kind of that he views himself as a spiritual father of so many. And in a lot of ways, it's because of Paul's teaching and preaching and interactions, he led people, to faith in Christ. So he was there when they were born again, if you want to think about it that way. But it's different with Timothy, because he was there at the beginning of Timothy's faith, but he was there, at the calling of Timothy. He's helped raise Timothy up in the faith, helped him grow and mature. He's watched him develop, not just into a godly young man, but a godly pastor, right? And so he has this deep, deep affection. But the other element of it is what you mentioned. And these all kind of overlap. He has worked alongside Paul. And it's not just like, hey, tag along, bring your kids to work kind of day. But I have raised this young man up, and he is following in my footsteps in the best way possible. He has served. Yeah. Yeah. And so the connection, the idea, there's all these things at play at the same time. If you thought highly of Paul, which they did, we've already discussed that. They loved Paul, and he loved them. But he's saying, if you think highly of me, then you're going to love him. And they did. They had high respect for him. But it's because he was following in Paul's footsteps. He's like, this is a young man who has the same values, the same work ethic, he's seeing the same things, he's doing the same things as a Paul, so he's following in his spiritual father's footsteps, both in manner and attitude and approach and godliness, all these good things, which again is a testament to what God is doing in his life. Okay. Lead by example, nice. Yeah. Yeah, that's contagious. Mhm. Yeah. 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 Sure, they kind of follow the leader one way or the other. Yeah, what example you set. So he sets a really good tone, as Paul did. So Timothy, everyone, well, at least we can tell here, was very much in favor. And they would want Timothy to come. And Paul wanted to send Timothy. And he's like, and I'm going to. I just can't yet, but eventually I will. And I'm hoping to come with him too. We're going to come back to that point here in just a minute. Let's talk about the other guy, Epaphroditus. This is verses 25 through 30. He's not as well known as Timothy was across the various churches, but from best I understand, he was from the Philippian church. So he was well known to them. When we get to chapter 4, the only other reference to Epaphroditus shows up in verse 18. And the point is, the Philippians, in their care for Paul, amongst the different things they did for him, one of them was they sent Epaphroditus to Paul, with a letter, with some updates about how things were going, and they wanted to check on him. But also they sent a care package with Epaphroditus to Paul. And then Epaphroditus' mission wasn't just to deliver these things like an errand boy, but then to stay there and continue to support Paul and care for him while he was in prison, and do what he could. So that's where he's coming from. And similar to Timothy, Paul held Epaphroditus in really high regard and great esteem. And there's several key phrases that indicate what Paul saw in Epaphroditus. So let's talk about those, and then we'll talk about how Paul is trying to make sure the Philippians understand who Epaphroditus is and as someone worthy of honor. But look again at, where is it? Verse 25. I think it necessary to send to you, so now, and we'll come back to this sooner than they thought he was coming back, but I'm sending Epaphroditus back to you. And then what does he call him? There's a couple of different phrases he uses here. So my brother, what else? Fellow worker, what else? And then one more, I think. Fellow soldier. Actually, I think there's two more. messenger. No, wait, minister, messenger. Which one is it first? Messenger, minister. Thank you. Let's talk about these. He just rattles these off and these are all good terms. He's bragging on him in the best way possible. This is my heart for this young man, and I hope that you see it too. So brother, we can talk in general terms as Christians. We're God's family, so everyone in this room are brothers and sisters in Christ. That's included, but we understand here in this context that Paul means it more than just he's a fellow Christian. He means this is a term of endearment, a term of affection. This young man is actually, I don't know how old Epaphroditus is, but this guy is close to me. He's my brother. I care for him. He cares for me. So that's a positive thing. Fellow worker and fellow soldier. Let's talk about these terms real quick. What does that indicate about Epaphroditus? Is he on the sidelines just kind of cheering Paul on? Sometimes we need people like that who are just encouraging. Hey, you're doing a great job. I love you. Or what? Sure, cheerleaders. We all need that. But what is he? Where is he? He's in the action, right? He's a fellow worker. He's alongside him. He's not on the same level as a Paul. We'll come back to that. Well, I'll just tell you right now. I learned today the language that Paul uses here, like literally, these are terms. Messenger is from the same word that we get apostle. And so Paul's saying he's an apostle, not to the degree that Paul is, but saying he's joining me in the work. He has a message that he's communicating, not just from the Philippians, but through his lifestyle and the gospel, the things that he's doing. Paul's saying he's living it out. Same here. He's a minister. He has ministered to me. So maybe he's not formally a pastor leader like a Paul is, or maybe even a Timothy, but he's saying he is doing good and faithful work right here with me. Work. He's putting in the work. It's hard. It's hard out here, but he's in it with me. A soldier. I really like this term. Paul doesn't give us any details of what he means here, so we're kind of using context clues. What does a soldier do? Soldier fights, willing to lay down their life. They live for someone other than themselves. They follow orders, and they carry those out. They have a mission that they're doing. And in warfare, it's really easy for me to talk about these things in the safety and the comfort of here. But in warfare, what does a soldier's life look like? It's hard. It's overwhelming. They're suffering, but they're focused, and they stay on mission because they have a greater purpose, and they're serving. Oh, sure. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and Paul uses this imagery in several of his different letters. Absolutely. In that place, I think he talks to Timothy as well. Anyway, but yeah, the idea that you're carrying is this is not just like a stroll through the park. This is hard work. This is warfare out here. Some of it is spiritual. A lot of it, most of it is spiritual to a degree. But some of it, in Paul's case especially, is no, this is literal. Like, they're after you. They're trying to kill you. I'm in jail currently because of these things. And he's saying Epaphroditus isn't on the sidelines through all this. He's right here in it with me. He's faithful. He's hardworking. He's diligent. He doesn't quit. He doesn't give up. And how do we know? Because Paul says he almost died. So that leads us into, if Epaphroditus was so great, and he is, Paul's not just, as people say today, not just gassing him up, trying to make him look good. He believes all these things, but he says, but I'm sending him back to you. Why? There's two main reasons why. Verse 26 says what? He's homesick. There's some of it. And not just like, man, this is really hard. I'd rather go back home and be with mom, have a home-cooked meal, sleep in my own bed. That might be some of it. So there's that. It touches on this. He loved his people. So yes, he wanted some of it to probably be back home in the familiarity of where he's from and where he's known in his own home, that kind of thing. But the deeper thing is, he belonged with them. Those were his people. He loved them. He cared for them. He lived and served and worshiped alongside of them, and he missed them genuinely and deeply. Absolutely, I get that. So that's part of it. And then what's the other part? So and they kind of blend together. He heard that they knew. He knew that they knew he had almost died, but they didn't know how he was doing. They didn't have, the internet or the telephone. Right, so they're worried. They caught news that he was dying and then didn't hear back what's going on. And so he was anxious about it and wanted them to know that he was okay. And so that's another reason he was recovering. We don't know what it was. This touches on this, though. As a faithful soldier and worker, something in the line of duty, if you want to think about it that way, he'd gotten sick or he'd gotten hurt in some way that almost killed him. And not just by happenstance, but specifically because of what he was doing, helping and serving alongside Paul. That's what put him in the position to go through whatever it was that almost killed him. But Paul says his eyes were on Christ, and he was faithful. And so Paul is saying all these things. I'm sending him back to you because his heart belongs with you. He's loved me. He's been good. He's been faithful. He's been everything that you wanted him to be and more. But I'm sending him back to you because his heart is longing for you so that you know he's okay and so he can be back with you. But I need you to know that he's not quitting. He didn't fail. The idea is that we're getting is Epaphroditus is coming home sooner than anyone expected. But Paul wanted to make sure when he shows up back home, it's not because anything went wrong. He has more than fulfilled his duties. He has blessed Paul's heart. He's been a perfect example of a faithful worker and follower of the gospel, all these things. And so when he gets back home, how does Paul say the Philippians should receive him? Welcome him. How? With joy. That keeps coming up. And what else? And honor. You should honor men like this. High regard. So you should be joyful. You should be excited that he's alive, that he's doing well. You should be joyful and encouraged because I've been so encouraged and blessed by his work and his faithfulness. And then you should honor him. You should respect him. Do we think, Paul doesn't say it here, and so we have to be careful not to speculate too much, but I think he points us in this direction. Do we think when Epaphroditus gets back to Philippi that they're just supposed to rejoice about what he had done and then just forget all about it? I think this is an ongoing thing. This is a guy you should follow. This is a guy who sets a good example. Be like him. When he says you should honor men like this, he's saying recognize this guy's character, which was on display through his work in the past, but now and moving forward in your midst, he's still someone you should look up to who sets a good example for you. Why might that be important? Who's not there with them? Paul. Are they just like, man, I hope we can just figure this out on our own? Or might they have someone who's been with Paul who can show them? What does it look like for me to keep my eyes on Jesus even though it's really, really hard? Oh, he's been there and he's done that. What does it look like for me to stay faithful, to love and to serve, even though there's pressure from the outside and it's not always fun from the inside? Well, he knows because he's done it. He's almost died, right? And eventually, I'm hoping to send this guy too also to encourage you and to strengthen you and to lead you forward in your faith. Do we see what Paul's doing? So again, this isn't just like random travel information, random updates about two guys they were curious about. Through the course of this letter and what Paul has been teaching, he's like, I'm sending you not just a letter you can learn from, but a person who's living out my teachings. A person who is living out the faith and what it looks like to be faithful and to be diligent and to endure through whatever comes your way. Someone who walks with Jesus in the power of the Spirit, and you already know him. So when he gets back home, y'all celebrate together, and then you be strengthened and rejoice, mutual encouragement in the faith, and keep moving forward together. Let me close with just a few things. One of the commentaries, one of the scholars I was reading, studying for this today, asked a good question that I had never considered. He asked, essentially, again, why is this in our Bibles? And is it helpful for us today? Because we know more about Timothy from Paul's other letters than we do Epaphroditus. But Paul in this passage isn't trying to explain who these guys are because the understanding is the Philippians already knew them. So Paul's just mentioning things, and the Philippians have context with these guys for this to make a whole lot of sense. But we don't, and we're not there. So why? Paul's not sending Timothy to us or Epaphroditus to us. So why do you think, how do you think, because I think it does, how do you think this speaks to us today? Why should we care? How is this helpful or instructive or encouraging or even convicting for us as we follow Jesus today? Because they still set an example. Good. There's a timeless nature to following Christ. Good. What else? Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, so we can, again, they continue to set an example for us today. Yeah, what else? I got 4 things. Real quick, I want to run us through. One, both these guys, did they just sit on the sidelines and watch Paul do the work? And from Paul's perspective, were they just like interns who kind of did some like grunt work for him so he could do the real work? What does he say about them? In my eyes, they're on my level. We are on the front lines together. We are brothers in arms. He's like a son to me, but we are in this together. I'm not ahead of them. I'm not advanced. They're not working under me or any of that. In my mind, we are in this together. And Philippians, earlier in the chapter 1, he uses the same language for them being partakers in the same gospel, partakers in the same. What is Paul saying? Who does the work of ministry? We do. Not just some of us. Now, we have different positions. We have different gifts, different callings. God has positioned us differently within the life of the body. This is 1 Corinthians talk. But we work together. We rely on each other. Paul says, I couldn't have done it without you, Philippians. I couldn't have done it without these guys whom you sent. And the things that you sent, he filled up. This is the end of the passage. He filled up what you couldn't do because you weren't here. But you sent him, and he did it. I needed him. I need you. They needed Paul and his encouragement and his insight and his instruction, right? So the life of the body and how we need, by God's design, we need each other and we are better together. We see that on display here. Secondly, as we've mentioned, both these guys are perfect examples that being a Christian or knowing Jesus cannot just be about head knowledge. It's not just a set of beliefs that we intellectually acknowledge or assent to. Yeah, I believe that about Jesus. Yeah, I know that to be true. That's a start, but where else does it need to show up in our lives? In our lives, absolutely. Absolutely. It has to be an ongoing, living, breathing thing each and every day. So these guys, especially him, we know him, he had his theology right. Well, he was trained by Paul directly. He had the right doctrine. He could preach and teach. He could explain things. But what made him so effective, such a good pastor, is he knew then how to live it out. He didn't just have the information. He had a transformation of the Holy Spirit working in his heart to then empower him to live it out. Same with Epaphroditus. Same for what Paul was saying to the Philippians. You too. Don't just know all the good things and the right things. That's great. Figure out how to show it up and display it in your life. Thirdly, third point, was someone saying something? Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, something to look for. Yeah, a good kind of template of what a leader looks like. Yeah, that's good. Thirdly, or nextly, and this is not a fun one, but we see it on display through both of them, and especially through Paul and the Philippians as well, so this should be convicting for us. Godly character, which these guys had, is shaped by faithfulness, absolutely, through really hard things. We don't get to escape it. We cannot avoid hardship and difficulty. And we already know that as human beings, just in life. We live in a broken, fallen world. Life is hard in so many different ways, sure. But specifically as we seek to follow Jesus and live out the ways of his kingdom, the way, capital W, right? Following Jesus, doing things his way, we can know, this is all throughout the New Testament, we can know that necessarily is going to bring suffering our way. But we can be faithful, and we should be faithful, and we can continue to endure. And then the beauty and the wonder of it all isn't just that God sustains us and guards us and keeps us going, but that somehow, some way, even those hard things themselves can have a positive impact on who we are becoming. God can use them to shape us into the image of his Son. And these guys are walking examples of what that looks like. He literally almost died. And yet I'm sending you back with him with the highest esteem. And then very lastly, look one last time at verse 25. Ultimately, Paul's got a lot of thoughts. Paul's got a lot of plans, a lot of good ideas. But ultimately, his plans rest in who? In Jesus. He says, I hope in the Lord Jesus. And that, in one sense, that's almost like kind of just, it sounds like church talk a little bit. But we know Paul didn't waste words. And so what he's doing, he's grounding all of this. I have plans, and I'm hoping and trusting that it's moving in this direction. But ultimately, for Paul, and then for us, who calls the shots for our life? Jesus. So Paul says, I have plans to send Timothy eventually. I have hopes that I'm showing up here soon too. I'm sending Epaphroditus right now. But ultimately, I'm listening to and I'm following and I'm resting in and I'm hoping in the Lord Jesus Christ and what he wants and what he says. So if things don't work out the way that Paul wanted or even the way that Paul planned, is he going to be okay? Absolutely. Why? Because he is so wrapped up in who Jesus is and what it means to belong to him that Jesus can send him wherever he wants. Anything can happen to Paul. We've already covered this. He says, I'm okay because I'm following Jesus, and that's what matters most. That's where life is. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on this tonight? Okay. Well, next week we'll jump into chapter 3. Right on time. Okay. Let's look at our prayer lists.